Welcome to Proto-Future from NPR, Modelers Public Radio, a show about building the plane of professional journalism as I'm flying it. This is episode 7, an interview with Tom Barbalet. In this episode, I speak with one of the most accomplished model railroad journalists alive today about how the hobby has evolved over the past 2 decades and whither it will go next. A brief programming note, this was my first time doing a 2-location interview, and as such, I'm still learning the ropes of professional audio, so I apologize if the quality is not always perfect. Now, let's jump right in.
But sorry.
No worries at all.
Just give me a second here.
Take your time.
Well, that's a good intro. Anyway, the effect of the microphone, I basically can't podcast anymore. My technology is all outdated. The technology that I use for leveling, I maintain an old Mac to do that. But even with this new Mac that I bought, it won't run Skype audio recorded. Basically, Apple has been fighting this for some length of time, and finally they've won. So all I could do is video recording now. And I had to pack up the mic. The mic's in my bedroom dressing room. And yeah, no, I don't podcast anymore. It's very interesting. 18 years worth of podcasting, probably tens of hundreds of hours of audio, I would have thought. And just particularly when the Internet Archive went down, because that had the majority of my podcasts on it. So yeah, I've been podcasting for a long time now, but now I just do these video casts, which give me an opportunity to actually see people as well as talk to people. And it's an interesting way. I've restarted what I had done with my biota podcasts through this thing called Last Monkey Standing, which was actually a piece of music that I recorded about 4 or 5 years ago when I had my open source name. I don't know what would we even call it currently, but the name of my project for about 20 years was Noble Ape. And then a comedian called Jim Gaffigan decided he was going to have a Noble Ape tour. And his lawyers decided to do some lawyer posturing, flexing. He's alleged lawyers. I call him an alleged comedian. I call his lawyers alleged as well. Anyway, so Last Monkey Standing was just a piece of music that I wrote around that time. But I also created a YouTube channel and do my simulation work in that YouTube channel. And similarly for my wargaming and other things, I have a YouTube channel that I've had for many years, more than a decade, called Monty's Reviews. And they're basically my 2 primary outlets, with the view that I have half a dozen friends that I can talk to on a periodic basis with regards to artificial life simulation and, simulation dynamics and politics and this kind of good stuff. So, yeah, former Model Rail podcaster. I think Model Rail video, I think I've done 2 of them. I might do a 3rd or a 4th, but it's not going to have the same buoyancy as Model Rail radio. And part of that is the start of the show being raided by 2 little misfits who are now very much my life. So yeah, it's just a strange transition. It was interesting actually thinking about chatting with you, because I don't really feel myself a podcaster anymore, or a model rail podcaster. Someone who's recorded podcasts for many years, but just when podcasts started to win elections, I decided, it wasn't really the format for me and went to video, which, is just where I am now.
I was going to say, Tom, if podcasts are winning elections now, we could have had the Model Railroad Administration, but you dropped the ball.
Yeah, it was completely my fault. I mean, I feel thoroughly responsible for, particularly as a non-citizen, for the situation that America finds. I mean, it's not like it's happened before or anything. So
there's a joke in there about immigrants coming into the country.
Something like that. Yeah, it's interesting, actually. There was a fellow who appeared on Model Rail Radio he was the Christmas train sets guy. Eventually, he realized that I was a foreigner, and that was the end of our friendship. So it was a very curious circumstance, and he said it was nothing personal, but he just couldn't maintain a friendship with a foreigner. And I was like, well, that's interesting, since you've been promoting your thing on my podcast. And literally, the NMRA National, I held his hand and taken him around to people and introduced him to all the people I knew. I did a bunch of, and really, he cramped my style completely. And people were like, why are you helping this guy out, Tom? Why he's such a curious character. Well, then he unfriended me because I was a foreigner. So anyway.
Wow, that's honestly astonishing. Okay, completely abandoning the script at this moment. Let's just jump like a page ahead. When we spoke last year, when you interviewed me, you asked about conservatism in model railroading. Uh, what do you think? Do you think it's significantly more conservative, and do you think that's inherently tied to the nature of the hobby itself?
In a curious capacity, and I think about this with model rail radio specifically. Model rail radio is about 50 to 70 close friends who can just jam randomly at any opportunity, and it's kind of self-assembling depending on who calls in, but then they can have talks accordingly. And I started to realize probably about 3 to 5 years ago, there were issues in the long-term friendships, which were really becoming very curious. And even people that I thought would never have falling outs had fallings out. Like people I knew in various parts of the world, thankfully not in South Australia. Thankfully, all the South Australians, I think, kept it together. But various other parts of the world, people just weren't communicating anymore. And it became very strange that the politics of model rail radio, which really, the politics and the death of model rail in the people who had appeared on the show, really changed the whole dynamic of the show for me personally. And it became difficult because there were people who I talked with for more than a decade who either didn't want to talk to me or didn't want to appear with other people on the show, and the whole politics of the thing, which is very strange behind the scenes. But certainly I was reflecting on this today. Thankfully, through video, you get to see the people that stuck with me. Yeah, it was just a curious group of majoritively men who, for whatever reason, got a great amount of... And look, model rail podcasting has not died. There's no get the hell out from this thing. It's ongoing, and I think the characters that have kind of continued it on are really part of that ilk of, kind of... It always interested me, the professor who appeared on Model Rail Radio periodically. He's had some really serious life and health issues, and yeah, he's one of the people who, thankfully, is still with us. But I thought, God, if something happens to the professor, it will all be over so much. So anyway, he is a character. When you meet him, he's nothing like the professor. I mean, you can see elements of the professor, but you realize that this was just basically a guy who was this character on a forum who made the character into a real character that appeared on the podcast. And when you actually meet him, really, he's just a perfectly normal, perfectly nice guy, not model rail obsessed, although when he brings out his louts, you can see how he's obsessive about them. But what you start to realize with podcasts is a lot of the people are actually characters rather than actual people. And the people part of it became quite interesting and quite curious. I mean, people who I would have thought were really quite close friends would just, ditch me at various points. And I thought, okay, well, this thing has taken a tone which, I mean, if I thought about this because I could possibly buy equipment and, find ways to audio podcast in the future if I wanted to still audio podcast. But I actually like the vision in the kind of gap. And obviously, I've got a few more Lionel Strang interviews in me yet. I mean, he hasn't written me off with regards to communicating, and I think the next one's going to be particularly interesting. But they're always pointed and somewhat funny. They seem to always catch me at various life circumstances and other curious things. But yeah, I think the nature of model railroading, just as a thing, is that it produces some very curious archetypes. And I've been able to capture a few of them. But they're temporal archetypes. So maintaining the archetypes for a lifetime, I think, is genuinely exhausting. And, I mean, a few of them passed away. So, I think the whole thing was just, particularly the last 3 or 4 years, was just a complete labor of love. And then it just got to the point where even my computer equipment won't let me record podcasts anymore. So anyway, that's the sum of it. But yes, I think it's a very curious group. And I think not necessarily conservatism, but just perhaps being set in your ways, or just a kind of group think. And also, I find this because I've changed my hobbies, so to speak, and I now do wargaming, predominantly what was historically called Games Workshop, what's now called Warhammer, which is basically the same thing. And the local community organizer who does those things here, and I regularly kind of butt heads in a very curious way, because I'm just, I've got a space, I'll open my doors, I'll feed you pizza. You want to come by at particular hours, then that's the deal. I've got armies, but I'm not a particular player. If you want to play my armies, I'm more than happy to put my armies down. And this is interesting because I think in these kind of hobby spaces, relatively niche hobby spaces, there tend to be curious characters that just gravitate to them. And I just tend to find them. My wife calls me an alpha nerd, which I think is a good way of describing a lot of my predilections, that I tend to be not passive aggressive, sometimes actively aggressive, just in the nature of my hobbies. And I think it all fits into that. Anyway, I'm rambling.
Oh, no, no, this is all fascinating. Oh, goodness, there's so much to go off of here. I guess my first thought is, do you think that it's related to, like, just the broader polarization of society over the past few years? Or maybe is there something specific to this hobby that it draws people that are inherently set in their ways?
There are very dark components to this thing. I mean, I think the things associated with death in particular, and just because, um, yeah, I don't necessarily want to talk too much on that, but just the nature of when people pass away and knowing that people have passed away, and ultimately their wives or the significant others are the people that control that information. I, as Joe Blow, who recorded a podcast, shouldn't be announcing these things, which is why some of them at least being public early was better. But I think there are a combination of factors here which are just uniquely curious. And I think because of the nature of, and I got this from a number of people who had particularly appeared in Model Railroader magazine, which is immediately a subset of the people that have appeared on Model Rail Radio. They tended to be people that saw what I was doing as opening the floodgates. What I was doing was creating, like people like Jim Lincoln, for example, who never had appeared in Model Railroader, probably never would appear in Model Railroader, but was just quintessentially someone who was a podcast persona. It's interesting now, I'm not sure if you followed him, but he now does kettlebell weightlifting videos, which is he calls himself Jimmy the Hammer. I would have always thought of himself as Jimmy the Soldering Iron, but he now does kettlebell videos, which is very curious because he appears in my YouTube feed periodically, particularly in the short form YouTube feeds, just lifting kettlebells and doing various things with kettlebells, and that's his life now.
I never would have guessed.
No, it's very cute. He does do occasional. He did a memorial to Craig Biscaya as a kettlebell video because obviously personal health is part of that long narrative. But yeah, it is very interesting that people like Jim Lincoln. Anyway, so I was told off for bringing people like Jim Lincoln into model railroading, and the whole nature of podcasting just coming in and giving these larger than life characters into the. And obviously, there were likes of people like Matt Goodman and these kind of folk that we call in on a regular basis as well. I do reflect on the late Terry Terrence. I mean, I think if Terry was still with us, probably there would be enough reason to continue on with Model Rail Radio. I have his podcasting mic actually directly behind me up there, and I have various bits and pieces of his railroad actually directly in front of me, so you can't see them. But when I look back at Model Rail Radio, I do think there are people like Terry Terrence in there who were genuinely fascinating people who I'm very pleased to have brought the world in on just his genius and his voice more than anything. So, there was a lot of positive things that came out of Model Rail Radio. I don't want to speak ill on it, but I do think there were certain aspects of the characters and certain aspects of the characters who you discover kind of late in the process that having done this thing, you realize, okay, maybe I shouldn't have done it quite the way I did it.
Interesting. I guess for a moment, since this is technically starting from a beginner's episode series, for the people who are maybe new to the hobby or don't necessarily know, can you describe what was Model Rail Radio? How did you get into it? And then maybe how did it change over the years?
2009. Basically, so my background is in simulation, large-scale simulation, biological simulation, what has historically been called artificial life. I've done this for 28 and a half years now. It's something that's like seeded my life. I started doing it when I was 19 and at university. It was like the thing. I mean, it's interesting what you do with your academic career because there are a number of bends and overlaps with regards to this panspermians et al. And I did that in podcast form for about 3 years, interviewing academics and people who made simulations of this. And I had this call-in format called Bio to Live, where basically I just left open what was a phone line that then became a Skype line and just had people call in and talk about their simulations. And this was perfectly natural. And we had academics and non-academics. We had weed smokers that would occasionally call in and do long hits and cough and all these kind of, we had a really curious group of people that called in on a regular basis and talk on Bio to Live.
I'm noticing a theme here.
Something like that. Anyway, so I thought, this has got to transpose to some other podcast format with some other thing. And I'm not a model railroader, but I have had one of my grandfathers and a great uncle I had on the other side were both model rail interested people that would at least pull out a train for around the tree at Christmas. And in the case of my great uncle, he was a steam enthusiast that had a Meccano steam engine that would go around the room and these kind of things. So that was in my background. And I did historically go to an annual train show at a special school held in Canberra, Australia, which is where I'm from originally. So I thought, okay, at the time, there was basically a podcast about model railroading. And I thought, this is ridiculous. This is a hobby. For example, in contrast, wargaming. Wargaming had 16 podcasts, including one that I dabbled with briefly, that were just being recorded on a regular basis by people who were, most of them, trying to make money out of podcasting. Anyway, so to cut a long story short, I thought there needs to be a live call-in show for model railroading. And who knows if it'll work. I can do at least 2 monologues associated with trains. So what part of recording these podcasts live was sometimes you'd have situations where people wouldn't call in. So you had to be ready to do a monologue if you had to. And some of these monologues went on for 48 minutes. Some of these monologues went on for 50 minutes. You know, you had to be able to have that self-driven narrative, which obviously I had in some rather curious way. Anyway, so Model Rail Radio was born in 2009. I recorded 2 monologues. That would have been the end of it. But a gentleman by the name of Chris Abbott called, and Chris Abbott basically created Model Rail Radio. He was, thankfully, I'm still in contact with Chris Abbott. He's a lifelong friend and just a fascinating man who has patience beyond anything that I could have had, just saint-like patience. And he was someone who, just for the first probably 20-odd shows, he and I talked about it, and then another gentleman called in, and another gentleman called in, then another gentleman called in. And pretty soon it was a group of friends that were talking. And the phenomenon of the podcast, just in terms of listeners, because having done both live and having done the both podcasts, I had 200 listeners on a good day. I mean, it wasn't rocket science, but nonetheless, I had at least a small audience. When Model Rail Radio reached 4,000 listeners in the first 2-3 months, I thought, okay, I'm onto something here. This thing, and it's interesting because I always used to joke that I couldn't stop doing Model Rail Radio because the listeners would come after me. Well, I think now, beautifully, there are so many model rail podcasts now that the reverse is true. It's not a situation where there's only one podcast. And the late Ryan Anderson was, who obviously is a figurehead in your life as well, was central because when he was doing his podcast, he thought, you know, this free podcasting thing is going to ruin his particular business model plans, which you were a part of, associated with getting video cameras and various other things. So, yeah, it's interesting how intertwined your and my life is with regards to this whole thing. Because basically then I started recording Model Rail Radio. I moved to the San Francisco Bay Area in 2011, changed the format of the show. That was the first show where I moved to Skype, which improved the quality of audio. I used to use these telephone call-in things that enabled people to call in on their landline or dial in on their internet connection. And it was interesting because Model Rail Radio actually broke Blog Talk Radio repeatedly. They weren't ready for 4 or 5 hour shows. So when we started doing Model Rail Radio for 4 or 5 hours, we started getting complaints, and they started doing things like trying to cut my telephone reception because I was doing it all over the phone, and I had to switch it out and do all these things. Anyway, so the format was laboured and changed, but in the end, there was a phenomena which I think is still the case, probably because many of these people I'm still quite close friends with, irrespective of the introductory narrative, that I can go anywhere in the world and we'll be able to meet people who I've done podcasts with. There's a fellow called Andy Dixon who lives in Wales. And although it's a somewhat curious topic in married life, we basically travelled halfway across the UK to get to him in Wales on one day. And we ended up having a curry in his kitchen and just talking to him and his wife and his son. Anyway, it was an amazing opportunity. And this was just the nature of Model Rail Radio, that by pushing air particles in this thing, you're able to generate friendships internationally. So it was just a phenomenon which, you know, saw me through a number of years. And towards the end, things became interesting. They became interesting for a series of reasons to do with, you know, other things. I mean, although my daughters were born, I think, pretty consistently through where things started to go downhill. It was, you know, it was an interesting format, an interesting time. And I realized that many of the people who I'd considered as friends really were very true friends. Ted Roy, for example, his wife, my wife, and I and Ted are getting together for some meal yet to be determined. He comes to Las Vegas periodically. Gordy Robinson turned up in my entryway 6 months ago. And he and I just had a very frank discussion about the NMRA, which was, I think if anyone has the opportunity to meet Gordy Robinson personally, I would do it, because the NMRA discussion is frank and to the point, and it tells you a lot about the NMRA that you kind of thought might have been the case, but to have actually a person confirming it in story form is always good. So, I've had this ability to meet people, and obviously people have a sense of who I am through my voice. But yeah, that's the phenomenon of model rail radio. If you're first starting out in this thing, it's still there. The Internet Archive has not gone down yet. So you could still go back and listen to, I don't know how many shows there are, 160 odd. I pulled some of them down because of various issues, but you could still get a number of them. And you get to see or feel the camaraderie at least. The late Terry Terrence, I would recommend any podcast that he's been on. There are a bunch of really interesting folk. The Professor is another good example. I think the introduction, if you're familiar with Lionel Strang in podcasting, talking to your audience, you will get a sense of how Lionel Strang became a podcaster, because literally he called into model rail radio. And apparently, allegedly, I wouldn't let him talk at one period of time, which doesn't sound like something I'd do at all. And he develops his own podcast from that turning point. So I think I've had the opportunity of being in the right place at the right time with a few of these intersections. And I certainly don't feel bitter or any ill will with regards to the experience. I think it was an amazing experience. I think it's a life experience. It's had pluses and minuses. But the pluses, just in terms of people I've known and people I continue to call close friends, well outweigh the minuses. So that's the story.
That's quite a story, and honestly, I just find it or at least in my mind, you were one of the first, and if not that, definitely one of the earliest model railroad podcasts, and also definitely consistently there. Other podcast empires rose and fell in the time that you were there yourself documenting it all, and so I can only imagine the experiences that you've seen, the changes that you've witnessed. You mentioned Gordy Robinson, who is of course like the Energizer Bunny of model railroading at the moment. Something that you asked me a year ago that in retrospect, it's kind of stuck with me. You said that one of Gordy's missions was, quote, youthifying the NMRA. And I wish I had asked you more about that at the time, because I'm just curious, especially you knowing him, but then also you having this, like, almost godlike supra perspective across the entirety of the hobby. I'd love to know more of your thoughts on, well, I guess, him and the NMRA, but then also maybe just the concept of youthifying the hobby itself in general.
There's an example which I raised with him, actually. There was a period of time in the darker period of the NMRA a decade or so ago, where a small offshoot, one of the, I don't know the terminology now, but one of the smaller chapters, I think in Florida, had cut a deal with some hardware store, a national hardware chain, actually, to start
Bunnings?
building. No. A national hardware chain in the US, to basically start layouts with kids and get kids involved, give a train set or parts of train sets together, and actually have kids come into these, I think it might have been Home Depot, and build starter train sets, starter layouts. And the whole thing seemed amazing, and it seemed like exactly what the hobby needed and exactly what young people needed. And, although I'm not a hardware store aficionado and someone who goes to them frequently, if I knew that was happening somehow, I would probably go and see that just as a phenomenon. Anyway, so that was all organized. They had the train sets, they had everything organized, and the NMRA as an organization squashed it. And they did it in a very curious way, which meant that all the good faith that had been generated through that was just eliminated. And I can't recall if I talked to Gordy explicitly about that situation, but it struck me at the time that the NMRA was an organization, and to be perfectly frank, it's an organization that I was already a part of, associated with recording them and documenting it. And I went to an NMRA event 15 years ago in Las Vegas, ironically, and recorded a bunch of them. And they struck me as a group of really very curious men who had gotten to their particular positions. And the whole thing struck me as just very strange that many of them had lost what the whole thing about model railroading was, associated with inspiring children. Now, that in and of itself is a problem politically. It's a problem if you have an organization that's primary outreach is for children, run by a very curious collection of men, you're going to not do well in this world. And I do understand that. But the whole thing just struck me as completely topsy-turvy. It was just something where the reasons for this thing weren't actively being discussed. There were a bunch of retiree heptagenarians that loved the hobby in their own particular fashion and wanted to hold on to it grimly and not allow a young audience to come in. And the whole thing just seemed very dark and somewhat lost. I don't want to narrate too greatly. Gordy didn't put that all in positive and straightforward light. There's still a fight to be had, let's just say. There's still something that needs to be done here. And really, I think probably in the past year, I've missed some of that narrative with regards to what Gordy is doing. But in meeting the man, I came to appreciate that this wasn't just resolved by him being in his position. It was considerably more systemic and required a lot more work. And quite frankly, I'm amazed with anyone who gets involved with the NMRA for any length of time, because it strikes me as an organization that is, if it is not fundamentally exhausting, even in the descriptive sense, just as it exists. So I wish Gordy all the luck in the world. I think he needs more than luck in some of these circumstances. I think it's a situation where if I were to do it again or differently, I would not create a splinter organization, but just say to people, we should be able to do this hobby the way we would like to do it without the politics and all the baggage that has gone along. It's difficult because there are a couple of stories about the NMRA, particularly early on in model rail radio, where the NMRA didn't do the right thing. And there's more baggage associated with that now. So, yeah, it's hard for me personally to talk necessarily about the NMRA coherently, bar to say that it's an organization with a series of paradoxes, and Gordy has got a lot of work to do. And my hope is that like-minded folk will get involved. A lot of the people who've been involved historically are at best curious, and at worst have done probably more damage than they should have done in their circumstances. I think that's probably the best I can say about it.
Do you think it's that the NMRA is itself just a gerontocracy, that the people in charge or maybe the board of directors are significantly older or maybe more set in their ways than the average hobbyist? Or do you think that it reflects, if not necessarily the entire hobby, maybe just the subset of people who are likely to be NMRA members?
It's a very good question. It's one that I've reflected on. My view is that in order to be a member of the NMRA and in order to be part of that thing, you need to have gone through a series. It's very similar to American politics, actually. In order to be a president, you need to have gone through a series of very curious things. In order to be a member of the NMRA, particularly a senior member of the NMRA, you need to have gone through a series of very curious things. And my perspective is it takes people like Gordy who've just come from left field and, moved in there. But then the organization itself has systemic problems. And the nature of this organization is being a real estate and media company. And, all these other very strange things that have just happened to it. I don't know if the model railroading hobby has aside from occasional model railroaders, people like Terry Terrence, but if you look at Combuck or what Combuck has now become, whatever that is, if you look at all these things, they've typically, some of them have had the right ideas to start off with, but in general, they've moved into something that has been just completely the wrong way to maintain these things. And I do agree with you in part that just the process of getting involved with the NMRA and being at a senior level where you're running conventions and doing these kind of things, in contrast, I think my experience in Australia was a bit different. And this is why I've tried to get Australians and British folk on model rail radio historically, was just to say it doesn't have to be done like the NMRA. Like the whole nature of a show in Australia, it's done very differently. The whole nature of a show in England is done very differently. The English shows are based on small-scale commercial ventures. If you have a layout that you take to a show in England, it is something you not just do as a hobby, you actually have your travel costs and various other things covered through doing that. The cost of your hobby is covered by being a model rail practitioner who goes to shows and displays layouts. Now, that is very different to anything that, exists in this country. My understanding is there might be something, or there have certainly been attempts to do something similar in Canada. Australia is completely different again. But you get the sense that these different countries, although I think the NMRA is trying to be more international now, which is another story, they all have different perspectives. And really, one of the things that I did give to the hobby was an ability to just talk to people internationally and point out that it doesn't have to be just the way it's been done here. It can be done other ways. Let's start exploring what those other ways are.
That's honestly, I can't have put it more beautifully myself. So that's actually a perfect segue. So you grew up in Canberra, Australia. That's the capital, right? And then you moved to the UK, and then the US and the Bay Area. And I'm assuming you've flown back to Australia from the US. Does that mean that you've completed a full orbit of the planet?
Many times over. In fact, I'm not sure what it means to me in time travel terms, because I've circled the Earth sufficient to have done time travel, as I understand it from my brief experience of quantum mechanics. So my sense is that, yeah, I've lived in a variety of places. It's rather curious, actually, because my daughters, who you've briefly met, can't be Australians and they can't be British. So the nation of birthright, which ironically is coming into call currently as well in this country, means that my daughters can't have my citizenship for very curious and quite bizarre, I would say racist reasons, or at least xenophobic reasons. So I have, through no fault of my own, found myself surrounded by Americans. And it is very curious, because if I were to settle anywhere, if I was able to settle anywhere, it would probably be in the UK. Australia was an interesting place to live. All the places I've lived have been interesting places to live. But there's a quality of the UK, particularly around just eccentrics and welcoming eccentrics, that I've been able to survive here by kind of lurking in the shadows, which is very much how I survived in Australia too. But yeah, it's interesting actually, because I've certainly seen a lot of different places. Your question had a point. Sorry,
Oh, no, that was just leading into things. Actually, so I was going to ask, when we spoke, you especially said, as far as being eccentric, that you really enjoyed maintaining a dislike of car culture that you brought with you to suburban Las Vegas, not a place known for its access to railroads. What has your perspective been like on, I guess, just urbanism itself, walkability and transit accessibility?
it's very strange that I ended up where I ended up. It's the nature, I think, of being married. It's the nature of realizing that life partners do sometimes mean you have to question almost everything in your prior existence. My perspective with regards to the culture here is very curious and toxic. And it's something that I don't know. I mean, in my perfect environment, I would have access, which I kind of did in the San Francisco Bay Area. The problem was I had too much access to street gangs, and I had too much access to people with fully automatic weapons that light the fire into houses. And I had too much access to community organizations that were basically run by police and the street gangs. And then my view is that and I live in the complete opposite place now. I live in a place called Summerlin, which is run by the Howard Hughes Corporation. And complete opposite to where I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area. So I don't know whether the Howard Hughes Corporation has a particular predilection against buses. They do have a predilection to make bus lanes in certain areas, which are just memorials more for bus lanes than anything. I wish I could be closer to trains. It's something that my brother came out here on Greyhound, and I think basically I can take a Greyhound to get onto the California Amtrak network when I want to do that kind of thing. My hatred of car travel is only equaled by my hatred of airline travel. So I really have developed, mainly through a number of really quite curious near-death experiences in planes and circumstances where, so when the plane falls, people start screaming, and then there's a point where they actually stop screaming. And I had the situation where a woman hung onto my arm inappropriately after the circumstances, the majority of the flight. But just in general, I had a situation in Germany where the tail rudder stopped working and people actually started praying on the flight. So, I mean, my view is if you fly enough, returning to your previous question, you realize that probably the kind of mass transportation that we do now as humans is completely and utterly unnatural. I would like to do more cycling. Las Vegas is not a cycling area. There are various opportunities. There are various cycle lanes, but you can use them 3 weeks of the year if you're lucky, based on temperatures. It is very curious that I ended up here. I do feel more and more that the Howard Hughes Corporation has framed my existence. I can normally look like Howard Hughes relatively rapidly, with dark glasses and a hat. But yeah, it's very curious being who I am in the place that I am, because I find that I do have the opportunity to interact with regular American folk on a periodic basis, particularly through my wife's sisters. And I do realize that I'm a distinctly different cat from the average American perspective, particularly with regards to just ground transport. Yes.
Have you noticed a change in the broader views of urbanism and public transport and cycling in the past? No, not at all?
No, America, at least in this part of the world, embraces the. I have met actually a fellow, ironically through wargaming, who is an avid user of bus services here, although he lives distinctly different area that I live. And I've also had to work out how to get him a lift to my house in various circumstances as well. So I have met one person who has made buses his life, but that in of itself is very curious and limits his perspective associated with. But no, I haven't. I wish I'd seen some utopian vision. I think in my dreams, I dream that I live in a utopian place on a regular basis, and remember, getting on buses and getting on light rail and this kind of stuff. But it just doesn't seem to happen here.
Are you following Bright Line West, though? Do you think that might bring anything?
Oh, my view is that I've been optimistic from when there was originally an Amtrak line that still, stopped in Las Vegas. In fact, my wife has been on that Amtrak line. So, unfortunately, it delves very quickly into politics, which is something in this country that I have this line that I say about particular aspects of my shared heritage, where I said, we have similar pain in our shared heritage. But that is a way that I can just say quietly, I don't particularly want to talk about politics.
Well, you are more than welcome to do so here. I remember you saying that model rail radio is no spice.
My view is that historically, I would have thought that I had a particular political perspective, and this country has completely robbed me of that political perspective. The nature of corruption, just living in the San Francisco Bay Area and seeing nominally people who would want me in their party, nominally, just behave in really quite disturbing and disgusting ways with regards to me personally, made me realize that as a migrant in this country, I can't afford a political perspective. It's very much taken from me in these things which are just satires of themselves. It's interesting, actually, because my family outside the US just assume that you have to have a political perspective in this country. And I try to kindly point out to them that that isn't, in fact, the case at all, that there's something particularly associated with just migrating to this country, which means that whatever you've had previously can't, in fact, mesh or connect with anything that has happened here. So that is it.
It's not the first time I've heard that perspective. Of course, at the university, several of my friends are international students. In fact, actually, my roommate, she's from southern Italy, and I think the way that she put it was that she feels much more emotionally and passionately about the politics of where she grew up, because, of course, that's her country. But here, she has an interesting distance from it. Obviously, for being a non-citizen and you can be deported, but also because it's kind of a more intellectual thing that you can keep at a distance. You're just learning about it. You're not as much living it as your own culture changing around you.
To be clear, I'm incredibly aggressively anti-political about Australia as well. And I am particularly because the politics of Australia, I was born in a year, which meant that I was taxed differently based on the year I was born. So with regards to university in particular, and if you have Australian listeners, they'll know exactly what I'm saying. The nature of the political parties in Australia was neither political party, although one political party would like to say they did more about this, did anything about it, and many of them just laid the taxation on top of it. And the fact that my daughters can't be Australians, that has no political colour. Both political parties in Australia worked against my daughters being Australians. So my view is that actually maybe I'm more political in being anti-political in some regard, but my view is that the place I'm from, the politics of the place I'm from, framed firstly my departure from the place I'm from, and secondly, that it hasn't gotten any better. It's in fact gotten worse. So I think the ability I've had, particularly here and to a lesser extent in the UK, is that I'm not affiliated with the politics of where I'm from. And curiously, I could see how someone might say that if they'd come from another country. But the nature of the countries I've left, mainly for political reasons, I mean, Australia is, I don't necessarily want to narrate this because I don't want to seem to be anti-Australian in a particular fashion, but Australia has compulsory voting, which means nominally that it's a crime not to vote in a country. And then you have things which you can't display your political distaste of what is happening if you can't not vote in a curious way. So there are a whole series of paradoxes just through compulsory voting which came through. And the nature of just what it is to be political in Australia is so pervasive and so toxic that I really find the whole thing very curious. So yes, I don't know. I just feel that if you came from a particular perspective, you would be able to say that. I think the thing in the US, which is more phenomenal, is that actually a lot of people die based on the policies of this country. A few people die based on the policies of Australia, but really a lot of people have historically died based on the policies of this country. It's a moral burden that my daughters will have to face that I don't have to face.
In the US, I guess the rest of the world is our Christmas island.
Well, just when I look at the nature of what's called loosely here political persuasion, and just think about, and I've known a lot of people from a lot of parts of the world that have become under the yoke of this political persuasion. Really, I find it very curious. If there's one thing positive that I will say that might come in the future, it is perhaps an understanding of how disgusting and disturbing this is, in contrast to perhaps, what has been lightly smiled about in the past in certain political circles. If something good might come out of what has happened recently, my hope is that it's a critical, perhaps a bleaker perspective with regards to what American politics has done today. I'm crossing my fingers for the ability of people who are listening in via audio. But yeah, I don't know. So what's the next story topic you have for me to talk on?
I was going to say, a question that I've always had in my mind, how did you discover me and the podcast? Because you emailed me less than 1 week after I had published that episode. And to me, I thought that I was just burning down all the bridges, that I was going to be ostracized from model railroading for saying all that inflammatory stuff. And then here, to me, like the longest running and most famous model railroad journalist alive today, all of a sudden wanted to talk to little old me?
Let me say this, because thankfully we've already talked about this. There's literally 3 weeks of the year where I can get out and exercise on a regular basis and just be comfortable exercising in my area. You put your podcast out through that period of time. So I was, by necessity, filling my iPhone with podcasts to listen to. I don't even know how randomly I got to yours. I think it was, I have this group of model rail podcasts that I really should listen to more, and you were part of that. So then I listened to it. I was like, finally, I was literally like right on, like as I was walking around. And I mean, particularly your perspective is unique. And it's one that I think is very emotionally apparent. It's one that overlaps with my perspective on a number of things. And I thought, this is a guy who I know everyone's heard of, but people should probably be listening to. So I thought, okay, well, what opportunity? I'm in the process of winding up my podcast. So I thought, okay, well, I'll get you on for an interview. We'll have a chat at least. And I think it was just universe dumb luck, basically, that put you in front of me at that particular time. I was going for a walk. I can't recall why I needed the walk, but I was definitely in need of the walk. I just needed to get out, clear my brain, and listen to something. Your podcast was on, and I just thought, finally, someone actually utilizing the medium for what it's supposed to be utilized for, like speaking your mind with purpose and, these kind of things, which I think in general, most of the podcasts I listen to or have been subjected to, more importantly, are typically pre-roll ads, just every bad aspect of podcasting that you can anticipate. And to hear you do your podcast with such fluency and such just, strong thought and energy, it's like, okay, I've got to email this guy as soon as I get back home. I put in my notes on my iPhone the list of topics that I was going to email you on. I think I got home, emailed you, and within a day you had responded. So the speed of transaction was good. I do feel genuinely embarrassed because you have since passed me stuff to listen to, which I haven't had the opportunity to listen to. The whole nature of listening to a podcast now seems relatively alien to me. But yeah, it was just dumb luck at that particular time. The weather was good. I needed to get out and listen to a podcast, and you were there. So,
a podcast journalist who thinks listening to podcasts is alien. I'm going to get you cancelled.
I'm already cancelled. I've already cancelled myself. I've cancelled myself. So my view is, I find myself in the position I find myself in, largely because technology has failed for me, but also because some of the fundamentals have failed for me as well. Well, just even agreeing, my wife agreeing that I was talking to you at 8 and not 7:30 this evening has failed. So small things fail.
I don't suppose you have listened to any of the podcasts. Do you have any favorite moments or not? Anything that you're looking forward to?
I listened to the next one. I really haven't, to be perfectly frank. I really haven't. My view is that once you have a good conversation with someone, you have a couple of good conversations with them, you get the sense that they're just going to be moving in the right direction. My interest with you specifically was as you leave your current place academically and where you actually end up going, because I certainly, your experience living in Europe, you're doing a variety of these things. I'm fascinated in seeing how that mechanically puts itself together. So as we speak now, you haven't resolved some of those issues.
Yep, still live in central Pennsylvania.
One of the things that I was hoping for was greater conversation associated with the curious overlaps that I've had with your academic aspects as well. And you're not, well, I'm not as frequent on Facebook as I once was as well. But the interactions I've had with people who've been astrobiologists or who still claim to be astrobiologists is something that I find fascinating. The nature of astrobiology just as a profession and how it's evolved in the past decade. I mean, it really has changed itself quite dramatically. And now I'm always fascinated by people who call themselves astrobiologists because there's always an interesting backstory behind it.
In my case, the backstory is probably the least interesting possible. Grew up in South Florida, saw a bunch of rocket launches, went to rocket museums. What other option was there?
Well, there are a number of options through that. I mean, you can get into hard physics, you can get into a wide... astrobiology, I think, specifically interesting to a group of people. Well, my long-standing friend, Bruce Damer, who now is running an organization to improve the characteristics of psychedelics in science, of all things, is a card-carrying astrobiologist. I've met a number of people, even through my professional career, who've ended up being astrobiologists. So I think the nature of where people come from to get to astrobiology is part of the unique story behind why I think astrobiologists are fascinating. Anyway.
So I'm not necessarily a true practicing astrobiologist. I come at it from the molecular biological perspective. And so I do look at things regarding bacteria with respect to their evolution of life on Earth, but there's very little experimental astrobiology. Unfortunately, we're not at the Star Trek level where I can just plop down on another planet and go testing. But I do, of all things, I earned a doctoral minor in astrobiology, so I'm very well versed on all of the actual research that people are doing, but it's mostly astrophysics, and then maybe a little bit of Martian soil chemistry.
Can you get spectrum from stars? I thought you could get chemical spectrum.
You can, but unfortunately, it's very difficult to get a chemical spectra of planets because just simply given the incredible distance away they are. I think we've now been able to directly image about 20 or so planets, most of them just by either using a coronagraph or like physically occluding the light of the star and then looking around next to it. But of course, in order to make that happen, these stars have to be very close by and the planets have to be very far away from the stars, well outside of the habitable zone. But the technology is getting better and better, and I think, the James Webb Space Telescope has a pretty good onboard coronagraph, and definitely the next telescope that they're working on, which, if the Webb is to be any indicator, will be around in maybe 60 or 70 years, with all the delays it had. But that should be able to get at least to the habitable zone of some nearby stars. And even then, and that's one of the things that I learned in the classes, that just seeing the spectra is only a small portion of the story, because you're looking for chemicals that have an imbalance that would normally be reacted away very quickly on astrophysical timescales. And then if you see that chemical imbalance, then therefore there must be something producing it. But there's really not that much more that we can do with it. It could be a function of life, or it could be atmospheric chemistry, and there's just one really weird volcano that's spewing out this weird molecule and putting it up. So until we can actually start traveling to other planets, there's not that much that we can do. But if I've learned anything from the field, it's that There's not that much evidence behind this, but this is my general impression coming away from astrobiology. It's that life is basically an energy parasite, and anywhere that there is an energy imbalance, probably the easiest one is photobombardment from the sun, there's probably going to be something that will pop up in order to make use of that, just so long as I guess there's liquid phase chemistry in order to make that cell happen. So I think the easiest thing to do for the moment is obviously Mars, because that did have liquid water on the surface, and unlike Venus, it's not molten away with weird geochemistry that would obscure any sort of fossils. Microbial fossils, to be clear. But it had running water, it had rivers and lakes. Let's just keep sending more rovers and then hopefully people in order to inspect those to see what we can find there. Anyway, I'm going on a tangent myself now.
It's interesting when you talk about the nature of life being parasitic on energy, because I think that's something that resoundingly comes through my conversations with people that simulate these things as well. And talk about Bitcoin and other things as being, parasitic on energy. So, yeah, no, it is interesting. I just like to hang around with astrobiologists for the reasons you just showed.
We're a quirky bunch. But then again, now that I think about it, so too are wargamers and model railroaders, so I think you have a type.
Well, yes. Yeah, part of being an alpha nerd is finding other alpha nerds, and sometimes you find yourself in very curious places.
All right, so I guess just a few questions to wrap up then. What do you think about the direction of model railroading? Actually, let's start a little bit smaller. What do you think of the ideas that I've been proposing of trying to have more walkable and specifically rail transit-oriented model railroads and model railroading as a way to kind of both refresh all of the modeling topics into something that's remotely more recent, and also just enrich things that people are already doing? It's like you have an op session with like 12 freight trains, or you could have an op session with 12 freight trains and 20 passenger trains.
And actually, it becomes more interesting with the 20 passenger trains too.
Exactly.
I think in part, you're living in the wrong country. This conversation has already happened as nauseum, and you have a number of really beautiful UK layouts based on that, and European layouts based on that. I think you're living in the wrong country for that. But no, I'm certainly very sympathetic to that. And I think the conversation has been asked and answered in a wide variety of other countries.
Do you think there's any way that the other countries could then migrate their ideas over here? Are there receptive people?
So, I mean, part of a sub-project I had with Model Rail Radio, specifically with regards to the professor, secondarily with regards to the folks in Kent, was their ability to bring their layouts to the US and show them at US shows, because that, I think, breaks down some of the, well, it's very easy for someone to actually see a layout and then understand what it's about if it's there physically. The smell in and of itself is a worthwhile thing to carry over. So part of that was having conversations with the professor about what it would take to travel a layout internationally, what it would take to, in terms of flight cases and these kind of things. I think that would start the conversation. I think YouTube has enabled some of that to carry over. I think it's a situation that will be taken care of given time in YouTube.
Do you think there are receptive audiences here, or are we going to get some more like NMRA board member style pushback of like, no, we model the 1970s fallen flags here, they can model the transit, but that's not our thing? Or do
You're
you
always
think
going to get that? That's just the nature of the NMRA. So my view is, will the NMRA change dynamically in the next decade? Hopefully, just through the nature of who is brought into the NMRA. But it's not something, if I was a betting person, I wouldn't bet the NMRA would be the benefactor of this largesse, for want of a better term. My view is that what you'll do is you'll have people that will just get nice YouTube followings, and people will start looking at those YouTube channels and think, why aren't we doing something similar? Or maybe we could start that experiment. I mean, I think the nature of how profoundly straightforward a number of your ideas are with regards to perhaps someone who's lived a slightly different life, but the nature that this actually, well, I've always put this to people. I'm thinking of Dave Brazza specifically, that adopting passenger transit on his layout put a kind of curveball in the works with regards to op sessions, and actually made op sessions more interesting. And so I think there might be a simpatico thing where let's make op sessions more interesting. But ultimately, it's down to people and their layouts, their choices. So I think the impact of maybe YouTube and these kind of things now might help for that. I remain optimistic. I remain positively optimistic.
I'd like that perspective, because optimism is in very, very short supply these days.
You can get it where you want it, I think.
I do want to draw it back to the fact that you're, I guess, a de facto hobby journalist. So, beyond my specific ideas and the current trifles of the NMRA, using your incredibly broad and longitudinal perspective, where do you see the hobby is going? Do you see it getting bigger? Do you see it improving? Are these just the same ideas running in circles with new people doing them? What do you think? What have you seen the evolution of model railroading being over your tenure?
I think the phenomena that the fear, which has continued, the fear that the hobby was going to die, forces people to make judgment calls which are just completely antithetical to actually continuing the hobby. This fear that this is a thing that won't amaze children. I was reading Thomas the Train, as it's become personalized in this country, book to my daughters this morning. I have a train which is no longer part of the modern Thomas the Train, but is historically part of the Thomas the Train. It doesn't have a face on the front. It's based on the actual train from Wales, thanks to Kent Garden Railway. Not because they gave me any discount on it, but because they actually produced it. So my view is that children will be fascinated with trains in the future. How they're fascinated, how their parents embody that. I've met many people, specifically in tech, who have really been aggressively hostile to the fact that children are receptive to trains, which I find very curious. But no, I think the nature of children being receptive to trains and what the hobby has for those children is very curious. I'm very thankful that a lot of the open source development that I thankfully run in parallel to my interest in model railroading has continued with model railroading. That I think will give Raspberry Pis and various other things to up-and-coming model railroaders. I think the nature of technology crossing into this is just phenomenal. I'm very thankful to folks such as Dave Falkenberg and Richard Murphy and Dave Barassa, and a bunch of people I've known who have just done work in this light and continue to make it a field where if young people come to it, they will immediately see, source code. Something else I know a little bit about. Let's actually delve into this stuff as well. So my view is that the fear of the hobby dying is going to motivate a series of bad things, just stupid mistakes. But thankfully, the way that people have left little piecemeal bits and pieces for future nerd kids to get involved with, I think is very positive.
Huh. So I guess there is hope, but there's still work to be done.
I cross my fingers, hopefully.
Goodness. Well, thank you so much, Tom. Is there anything else you want to add? Any other thoughts?
I'm fascinated by, you started doing this when you were about 7, right?
It has been a while, on and off. I think I really got going when I was 11 or 12 with Model Railcast Show, and then it's been largely on and off through various different mediums here and there. But then, at least as far as this podcast went, I think it started maybe 6 or so years ago, but very infrequently, like 1 or 2 episodes a year. It really has, in terms of concretifying my efforts in model railroading, it really only has been the past 2 or so years.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. No, I think the fact that you were a character on the Model Railcast Show, particularly a character who, because you were costing Ryan Anderson money and you'd taken a video camera for some reason, you were constantly narrated in such a curious way. I mean, I think finding you at the period of time that I have found you, and just realizing you're the same dude, has been really very, interesting. I've always found it very curious that there was this kid who'd managed to swipe a video camera through the whole process. But no, I think more power to you. Thank you for continuing this effort. If I think, again, of buying a mixing desk to do audio podcasting in the future, it will be because of people such as yourself. So, I mean, thank you for reinvigorating me in a very curious fashion. Unfortunately, not generating podcasts in audio form, but certainly in video form. And we're now recording this in video. My hope in the next day or so is I'll get it back to you in audio, and you can take it from there for your audio junkies. And no doubt I'll receive, hopefully, a couple of emails from previous listeners to Model Rail Radio. But no, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity to talk.
Thank you so much, Tom. I wanted to give you a chance to plug yourself. When you interviewed me the first time, I was so new at this, it never occurred to me to send out my website and have people directed towards my efforts. So at least with your insight, realizing that I needed to do that for myself, I shall return the favor. How can people find your current efforts?
My last name, Barbalet, which ends in a T at gmail.com, is the easiest way to get in contact with me. I maintain my open source, which is apestk.com. If you're interested in my writing academically and otherwise, simulation just in general, there's a lot of documents there, including a visa letter from Steve Wozniak, of all people. So there's a bunch of curious anecdotal stuff just to say, once you've been expunged from the internet, as I have been, you realize if you're going to put something together of all new. I don't think there's any links to Model Rail Radio through that. There is from barbalet.com, I think, or there was historically from barbalet.com, which is my last name.com, viewable and interactable through various social networks. So feel free to add me as a friend. Tell me that you heard about me from this particular recording. Email works that way as well. And for those of you who I have had the opportunity to interact with and had the pleasure of talking with, don't consider this a goodbye in any regard. I think it's more I just need to get to a position in my life where I know what the next thing will look like and then gather together. But if you're interested, London1940.org is my simulation of London in 1940, which I've very recently been able to get back into thanks to fixing a bunch of bugs that Apple was able to put in one of their operating systems, which is just the nature of my day-to-day open source life, running simulation software. Anyway, so maybe sometime we'll have the opportunity. Maybe I'll invite you back on Last Monkey Standing, which is my artificial life, to talk about astrobiology and origins of life questions, which I think are really fascinating and ones that I could do for extended periods of time. In terms of your particular trajectory, I have the intimacy of talking with you. Are you going anywhere? What are your next steps looking like, if I can ask you?
So I just had a chat with my PI a few weeks ago about what graduation looks like. So I will probably graduate as a 7th-year PhD student, which is more or less on track with how long it typically takes people in my field and in my program. Obviously a little bit set back with the pandemic because all of a sudden the entire world was interested in acquiring molecular biology reagents. Who would have thought? But it looks like
eventually, right?
You're not wrong, but it looks like I'll be graduating in August at the end of the summer. I had initially remained open to the idea of living in the US, just in like one of the more trainable, more environmentally friendly corners of it. Actually, something that I absolutely will turn into an episode at some point. I made a tier list of every single city on planet Earth. I had a spreadsheet of 360 of the largest cities on the planet. It's a giant spreadsheet. I ranked them by, I think almost 100 different categories, like whether or not I could take train trips around, how car-centric it was, but also things like, can I go camping, or are there nearby model railroad clubs? And it took me a long time to put this spreadsheet together, and I eventually then ended up sorting it, and the things that rose to the top were obviously a bunch of European cities because they're all largely quite amazing, but also things like Minneapolis and Chicago. Minneapolis for its incredible bicycle infrastructure, Chicago for its incredible train infrastructure, but of course nowhere in the United States is perfect at the moment. It's quite a bit lacking. We've been set back over the past few years and need a kick in the pants, but if I was going to stay domestically, I was thinking of staying in places like that. Now, as a result of the most recent election, just simply being an openly queer and leftist academic, I'm kind of at the nexus of a bunch of things that a supermajority of the rest of the country has said that they absolutely hate at the moment. And
That's like from Elon Musk.
If
you want life on Mars, he might be able to help you there.
Well, he's going to go to Mars. I don't think he's going to go to Mars successfully. I think there's going to be a SpaceX scrapyard of all of the attempted landings, and then I think that the good old governments are probably going to arrive at just about the same time he does successfully. I'm still stung by his, what was it? It was the 2018 attempt to get to Mars when they would have launched in like 2015-16, and that went absolutely nowhere. So, I don't know. Back in the day, I appreciated his optimism, but I don't think that the Cybertruck is indicating that he will be able to get there.
I'm teasing you. I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries at all. But at the moment, like academically and my career-wise, I have a lot of my friends are, if they're international students, they're looking at going back home to where they came from. Some of my closest friends and roommates who are Americans are now weighing the ability to emigrate to mostly Australia and Canada seem to be the popular ones. My sister has left for grad school in Cambridge. And then, yeah, so I think at this point, probably the most likely answer, especially in terms of like academics, places that have universities of a similar caliber, it's probably looking like it's going to be Berlin or Munich. Maybe other places like London, Cambridge, Oxford, Amsterdam, or several places in Sweden as well. So it's kind of balancing just the absolute need to get out of the country, but also not committing career suicide in so
Housing
doing.
is difficult in Sweden. I have a friend who's a Swedish academic, and he's lived in England for, I don't know, the past couple of years just because he can't get his place in Sweden. So he's done it remotely.
Interesting.
It is interesting. My father was at Cambridge. He had Stephen Hawking ran over his foot. Said, "Watch out, Papa." Back when Stephen Hawking
in the wheelchair or a car?
In the wheelchair.
Okay.
Back when he was still talking. So yes, I always fit that story in. But no, there's some beautiful places in the UK. Have you looked at California at all? Or does that just not take your boxes?
Yes, I would say probably mostly the Bay Area, like obviously Berkeley and UCSF are the two really big ones. I do like San Francisco, or at least the Bay Area, because it does have a lot of rail infrastructure. It has BART, but I think I heard that they culled their frequencies and headways a lot in the post-pandemic. Like if I went to Stanford, San Jose would be the nearest big city, and it does have a light rail system, but it's famously one of the lowest ridership per mile light rail systems in the country. So there would be plenty for me to explore there, but California as a whole is still just a little bit too car dependent. It does seem like it's a big enough state that has enough liberal clout that it would be able to protect me from the oncoming onslaught of presumably, among other things, xenophobic and anti-queer politics that we're going to be getting. Just straight up for my own personal safety, I think I will only be able to go to a blue state for that very reason.
No, that obviously, yeah, no, my view is look internationally.
Yeah. And also another thing too, it's just I'm at that stage of my life. It's like if I was 40 or 50 and had kids, then okay, that would be a lot harder to fly away to a random pick a point on the globe country. Now I'm a little bit unattached. I'm very unattached, really. And I also would have to move anyway. Academic inbreeding is frowned upon severely, so there's no chance that I would be staying in the same place that I live right now. So I would already have to move for a postdoc. Why not try something just a little bit farther away, a little bit more interesting, and just get a whole adventure out of it. See what all these Straßenbahns are about.
No, yes, if I could do it all again, landing in Germany would be great. No, I have no other questions for you associated with that. It's been an absolute pleasure. We probably should do it again through Last Monkey Standing associated with the origins of life. Maybe closer towards when you were actually graduating. We got a wide variety of really quite curious academic listeners.
I've been called worse.
Now it's a video podcast. You do have rather curious interactions of people saying, "Oh, Tom Barbalet, I remember your podcasts so many years ago." So
wow,
that's one of the interesting things of it. But yeah, no, I think we need to do this conversation again in a different thing, not related to Model Row, and give an opportunity. I do like your background. Are they magazines in the pile, or are they...
Yes, it's a huge stack of old magazines that I've been collecting over the years. So I used to volunteer at a tourist railroad back when I lived in the Seattle area, and I would always take a few of my old model railroad magazines and just give them out to all the kids on board. Then I moved here. There isn't a nearby tourist railroad that I've been able to volunteer at, and so over the years I've just been collecting a bunch of old magazines in the assumption that someday I would be able to return as a conductor and give them out again, but I don't know how it's going at this point.
Priority mailboxes for that exact purpose, actually. I use them a lot more. So, yeah, I priority mailboxes in order to send the stuff away.
I'm reminded of a comment you made many, many years ago about how model railroading is inherently a hobby of hoarding.
Ain't that the case? Ain't that the case? Anyway, John, pleasure as always.
Thank you so much, Tom.
Take care.
This has been episode 7 of the Proto-Future podcast, interview with Tom Barbalet. The theme music is Spark of Life by Benjamin Lazarus through Tribe of Noise. I would like to thank my extremely generous and patient patrons Pedro Reyes, Andrew La Vergetta, Ron Kleiss, Bill Ford, and Linda Eskin, whom I recently learned subscribe to the Patreon without ever having listened to an episode. I'm so sorry to disappoint you, Linda. And extra special thanks to new patron Roger Coleman, who said he joined because, quote, nobody hates Republicans more than I do, unquote. Challenge accepted, Roger. And finally, my supremest thanks to Tom Barbalet for agreeing to be interviewed and platforming my efforts. If you would like to know more, you can visit the website at www.bgtmring.org. That's Bravo Golf Tango, Michael Romeo Romeo, Indigo November Golf, Oscar Romeo Golf. To listen to the Manifesto and Prologue series, watch the Modern Modeling Clinic anthology, or read the free-to-access Patreon production blog, and please consider donating on a monthly basis to help defer hosting and equipment costs and support what I do. This podcast was written, recorded, and produced on the ancestral lands of the Susquehannock and Nawothi Southern Paiute peoples. I would like to thank them for their historical stewardship of central Pennsylvania and southern Nevada. Thank you very much for listening. Keep riding trains, keep punching Nazis, and keep building a better future.